So even though I'm late to the party on this particular issue, I couldn't not talk about an absurd article about Bernie Sanders, which is probably one of the most hackiest hit pieces I've ever read. And this article is important not just because it highlights the stupidity of the so-called resistance and their opposition to Bernie Sanders, but it really sheds light on the broader media climate in the United States of America. So journalist Maria Perez of Newsweek attacks Bernie Sanders because, as you might have heard, he wore a $700 jacket. She writes, Senator Bernie Sanders sported a $700 coat on Monday during New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio's swearing-in ceremony. The socialist was cozy and warm in a $690 Burton 2L LZ down jacket as de Blasio was assuming office for the second time in a row during the frigid temperatures at City Hall. Sanders, 76, joked, saying of the weather, by Vermont standards, this is a warm and pleasant afternoon. Sanders is famous for slamming the billionaire class. In November, he penned a lengthy column on CNN criticizing the Trump administration and arguing that the wealthy are never satisfied with what they have and always want more, more, and more. But that jacket Sanders wore was pretty pricey despite his plight to fight against the wealthy. Sanders' June financial disclosure form stated that he earned more than $858,000 in book royalties alone, in addition to his Senate salary of $174,000. Sanders is part of the top 1% nationally. Sanders' six-figure income has not deterred him from criticizing the rich. In April, the senator tweeted, "How many yachts do billionaires need? How many cars do they need? Give us a break. You can't have it all." However, the backlash was swift, with dozens of Twitter users pointing out that Sanders had 3 houses and is one of the richest politicians in the United States. Sanders and his wife Jane bought a summer home in Vermont on Lake Champlain in 2016 to add to their houses in D.C. and Burlington, Vermont. Local magazines 7 Days reported that the Sanders family paid about $600,000 for their lakefront home in North Hero, Vermont. Despite his salary, the senator wrote that people need to come together to take on the greed of the oligarchs. Got him. Wow. So I don't even know where to begin. The argument itself is illogical, but this journalist couldn't even bother to get basic facts right. So, first of all, Bernie Sanders did not purchase that jacket himself. As Jane Sanders points out, it was a present from his son, and when it comes to the vacation house, Bernie Sanders doesn't own 3 homes. And the implication in this article is that a socialist shouldn't own 3 houses, but Jane Sanders also cleared this up months ago. So as Snopes writes, Jane O'Mara Sanders said that she had inherited a vacation home in Maine, but the family was unable to make use of it due to its distance from their primary residence in Vermont. So she sold it and used the proceeds to finance the purchase of a more suitable vacation home in North Hero. So in other words, they were able to purchase their second home by using funds from the property they sold that Jane Sanders inherited. But let's be extra kind to this author here, and let's actually assume that Bernie Sanders did not receive this coat as a gift and that he spent $1,000 on it. Let's also assume that Bernie Sanders does in fact have 3 houses. He doesn't. And let's also assume that he is in fact one of the richest senators in Congress. That's also not true. There are people who are multi-millionaires. I mean, you have Nancy Pelosi, net worth of over $100 million. But let's assume that she's correct here. Would that make Bernie Sanders a hypocrite? Would that make him a pseudo-socialist? The answer is of course not. Bernie Sanders has never argued that people shouldn't be allowed to be wealthy or spend money on expensive things. He's saying that wealthy people can still do all of those things, but they can't shirk their responsibility to the country. They still have to pay their fair share of taxes. They can't buy politicians that will rewrite tax codes for them in order to make themselves even richer at the expense of everyone else. If you're rich, you have a responsibility to look out for those less fortunate than you. Now, if Bernie Sanders started to take the revenue from his book and stored away the tax dollars in some tax haven, or started buying off politicians in order to give himself more tax breaks, that would be a different story. I could see why you would be peeved about what he's doing, but that's not the case. Bernie Sanders is paying his fair share of taxes. Bernie Sanders is still advocating for the rights of the less fortunate in this country. And even though a lot of millionaires are in fact out of touch with the plight of normal Americans, Bernie Sanders tours the country on a regular basis speaking to ordinary Americans. So he's not even out of touch. And with the amount of money he's making, yes, I would admittedly characterize him as someone who's rich, but so long as he pays his fair share, I'm okay with that. I'm not okay with billionaires because I think that's too much wealth, and that is inherently greedy. But for someone who just has a couple $1 million, I really don't have a problem with that. I think they have a responsibility, and Bernie Sanders is really doing a good job at living up to that responsibility. He's fighting for everyone else to make sure that poor people don't have to struggle and live paycheck to paycheck. Simply being rich doesn't automatically make someone a bad person, with the exception of maybe billionaires. But she is implying here that progressives had advocated this position when nobody has. Bernie Sanders hasn't. Nobody has. Jill Stein has a net worth of more than $5 million. FDR was a multi-millionaire who inherited the wealth from his family. FDR went on to sign the New Deal into law. Jill Stein was one of the most progressive presidential candidates in American history. You can be rich and still fight for the American people. Bernie Sanders doesn't have hundreds of millions of dollars. That's a different story. Billionaires, I think that in and of itself is a moral issue because nobody can ever spend $1 billion. But Bernie Sanders, he's wealthy. He sold a book. He sold a couple of books, actually. And senators in general are wealthy because they make $174,000 a year. I don't have a problem with that so long as they're fighting for us. The problem I do have is that millionaires in general, multimillionaires specifically, they want even more wealth. They want to be even more greedy. They'll rig the system in favor of themselves to take money out of our pockets and give themselves even more tax cuts. That's what we saw with this tax reform plan. We saw Republicans rob the poor in order to finance tax cuts for the wealthy. That's what we have a problem about. Income and wealth inequality. So this article really sheds light on just how poor the state of American media really is in this country. They don't have any substantive way of attacking or criticizing Bernie Sanders. So neoliberal hacks like this author have to resort to pathetic and failed attempts to smear the most popular politician in the country because, what else are they going to attack him on? If you really think about this, if you have nothing more to do than write articles about Bernie Sanders wearing a $700 coat, then I think it's not wrong for me to point out that maybe you should really do some introspection and think about why you got into journalism. Are you just trying to smear Bernie Sanders for no reason because you don't like him and you don't want him to run in 2020 because you want some neoliberal hack like Kamala Harris to run? If you really wanted to criticize Bernie, you can write about foreign policy issues that I think he's not progressive enough on. But of course, her candidate will inevitably not be even remotely as close to Bernie Sanders is on foreign policy issues. So even though Bernie Sanders isn't progressive enough on foreign policy issues, on some foreign policy issues, he still leagues more liberal than any of his Democratic Party opponents who might run. So they have nothing. And it's pathetic. And quite frankly, I think it's embarrassing.
Support this podcast by becoming a patron at patreon.com/Humanist Report.